Welcome to this week's edition of Good Books, where each week we interview an author of a newly published work of nonfiction that we believe is worth your time. The views expressed on this program do not necessarily reflect the views of the University of Texas Brownsville or this station. And now, here is your host, Dr. John Cook.
Welcome once again to another edition of Good Books. I'm your host this week, Dr. John Cook, Associate Professor of Communication at the University of Texas at Brownsville and Texas Southmost College. And with me today is Marjorie Hines. She is a civil liberties lawyer, writer, and teacher, and founding director of the Free Expression Policy Project. Her previous book, Not in Front of the Children, won the American Library Association's 2002 Eli O. Bowler Award for Best Published Work in the Field of Intellectual Freedom. Her earlier books include Strictly Ghetto Property, the story of Los Siete de la Raza, Cutting the Mustard, Affirmative Action, and the Nature of Excellence, and Sex, Sin, and Blasphemy, A Guide to America's Censorship Wars. I may have to read that one as well. She is a graduate of Harvard Law University, and we're here today to talk about a very interesting read entitled The Priests of Our Democracy, the Supreme Court, Academic Freedom, and the Anti-Communist Purge. Ms. Hines, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
This is an interesting read which takes us through most of the 20th century, beginning at a time of anti-Semitism and communist phobia. Why don't we start with the idea of academic freedom, which hasn't always been a clear concept in American culture?
And it remains unclear. Many people argue about what it means and whether it should exist at all. But it really starts, the concept starts before you even had communist parties, before the Bolshevik Revolution, which inspired communist parties in the U.S. and elsewhere, in a period when you had various utopian socialist movements, you had labor organizing going on in early part of the 20th century, late part of the 19th century, really encountering huge resistance from the corporate employers. And you started to see a generation of professors who were activists, Christian socialists, supporters of labor, the right of labor to organize. In one famous case involving the young Professor Scott Nearing at the University of Pennsylvania, opposing child labor, advocating for laws that would limit child labor. And these professors were not popular with the boards of trustees of the universities, which were largely dominated by corporate executives. Stanford was another example, had basically a one-person board of trustees, the widow of Leland Stanford, and she didn't like one of the activist professors out there, and forced these people to be fired. And in response to that, in 1915, a group of prominent professors gets together and forms the AAUP, the American Association of University Professors, and the first thing they do is publish a Declaration of Principles on Academic Freedom, and they define it as having three parts. One is the freedom, all within limits, none of this is unlimited, and all subject to the judgments of your professional peers in your field as to what is competent teaching and what is competent scholarship. But a certain level of freedom within the classroom, a certain level of freedom within your field of research and scholarship and publishing, and a certain level of freedom outside the walls of the university, so-called extramural speech. And that was what was really at play, for the most part, in these early firings. As time went on, the other two prongs, freedom in the classroom and freedom of scholarship, became equally important. And these principles became accepted in universities, at least in principle, but often subject to political pressures. And as my book chronicles, by the 1950s, when the Cold War and a variety of political agendas in the United States inspire a really prolonged, intense, and abusive period of loyalty purges and investigations, the universities are, for the most part, completely acquiescent, and they don't stand up to the pressures from legislative investigating committees like the House Un-American Activities Committee, which, of course, its first chair was Martin Dees of Texas, but after World War II, it had other people running it, including, for a time, Richard Nixon.
Right.
So academic freedom is a principle that's largely accepted, but it took a long time for it to be incorporated in the First Amendment as a matter of Supreme Court rulings. And it is still today tremendously controversial.
Excuse me. I think that was one of the most surprising things is how little the First Amendment was emphasized in the early 20th century. And there are two locations that sort of gave birth to these notions, and they were really, you refer to Wisconsin as a crucible of social reform ideas. Wisconsin and New York City had folks, intellectuals of various types, especially professors, who were working on social reform and might have been socialists, might have been members of the Communist Party, but reform with regard to labor laws, reform with regard to oppression of minorities and that sort of thing. I was interested particularly in Professor Richard Ely, who was very active in social reform early on, and actually was one of the first to win a case on academic freedom.
Well, Ely was one of the leaders in this new field of social science. He had actually studied in Germany, which was where ideas about academic freedom, interestingly, were first developed. The university environment in Germany respected a fair amount of autonomy on the part of professors. He got his graduate education there. He comes back to the U.S. He starts out at Johns Hopkins, introducing such innovations as graduate programs and seminars and the kinds of training for scholars that eventually came to dominate American higher education as well. And he assembles around him a group of followers who are also very politically engaged in reform. And he ends up at the University of Wisconsin, where, as you say, there was already a state that was very interested in not only social reform and using government to enhance the welfare of the population, but in making use of experts. The whole notion that intellectuals and scholars could actually be useful for something in addition to advancing knowledge and teaching students. So Ely is charged by a member of the University Board of Trustees who doesn't like labor organizing with having improperly pressured a local businessman to accept a union and work only with employee-only union workers. He, in fact, was innocent of the charge. And one of the ironies of this case that subsequently became so famous was that he said, if I had done such a thing, then I should be fired, which is not a principle of academic freedom that we would accept today. Mm-hmm. But the university and the people who supported him, including a committee of the Board of Trustees, which was set up to adjudicate this charge, sort of took it well beyond what Ely was arguing, and said, and not only vindicated him, but said that principles of academic freedom, the principles of the freedom of a teacher to speak and be active in public affairs, as well as to pursue his or her scholarship wherever it may lead, mm-hmm. Was sacrosanct. And I'll read you the quote that is most famous from this decision of these Wisconsin trustees. Quote, whatever may be the limitations which trammel inquiry elsewhere, we believe that the great state University of Wisconsin should ever encourage that continual and fearless sifting and winnowing by which alone the truth can be found. And I like to think that sifting and winnowing, which is the title of the first chapter of my book, mm-hmm. describes this period, comes from all the farming that was done in Wisconsin. That metaphor comes out of their experience, and eventually that quote from the Wisconsin Board of Trustees in 1896, I think, was put onto a plaque that is on the wall of one of the main buildings on the campus.
Mm-hmm. I want to touch on one more thing in sifting and winnowing, and then talk about the title of your book itself. But another charismatic, popular teacher that was important in the early 20th century with regard to this was Scott Nearing at Penn. And the question of whether universities were like businesses and could hire and fire at will became sort of a focus in terms of his career.
It did, and Nearing, who went on to have a long career as a democratic socialist and in his last years a vegetarian and an organic farmer. He lived to be a long time. His academic career was frustrated, and he was a brilliant young economics professor, very popular at the Wharton School at Penn, and also very active in the movement to end child labor. And this is evidently what got him in trouble with the Board of Trustees, and he's fired, and he is quite a brilliant publicist. And by this point, it's 1915, and things are already, there have been several previous cases before this. So academics are beginning to organize, and there's really a nationwide debate as a result of the firing of Scott Nearing. And this is what leads to the AAUP being formed.
And the AAUP, in that document 1915, the Declaration of Principles on Academic Freedom, and also academic tenure, which is also an important part of this whole concept of what professors are really about in their relationship to employment at universities. But you mentioned universities getting involved across the nation. Clark, Columbia, Cornell, Harvard, Princeton, Wisconsin, and Yale got involved in this. People like John Dewey were involved in this. So this was a widespread effort.
Yeah, it was really the most prominent professors around the country. And at first it had a kind of elitist ring to it, and not everybody was invited to join the AAUP. Well, they soon got beyond that. And this notion of linking academic freedom to tenure, in the historical context, you could see why that would have been considered very important, because without the protections of tenure, trustees were just forcing university administrators to fire people without any kind of inquiry into their competences. Teachers or any other reason had to be given. I talk about this toward the end of the book. We're facing a very different situation now, where tenure is under a lot of stress, shall we say, and is being attacked. And for sure there are deadwood professors, just like there's deadwood in every field. So arguments are being made, well, this isn't such a great thing. And as a practical matter, universities have gotten so bottom line at this point that, as I point out at the end of the book, the majority of people teaching undergraduates today are not tenured or even on a tenure track. They're contingent faculty, as it's called. They're adjuncts who are paid very small amount of money on a per-course basis with no job security, no benefits, usually no office. And they're often very good teachers. I mean, I'm an adjunct at NYU. I spent most of my career as a writer and lawyer, and it's fun for me to teach a course at NYU, New York University, but it wouldn't be a living, and it would be nice to have an office. So, folks in this position also need academic freedom, because you were asking me about the title of the book, Priests of Our Democracy. The notion is teachers are priests of our democracy, and this is a quote from Justice Felix Frankfurter in a case that was actually decided at the height of the anti-communist furor. He says, teachers are the priests of our democracy because it's their job to foster those habits of open-mindedness and critical inquiry, which alone make for responsible citizens. So the notion is it's about a philosophy of education that teaches people how to think, not just what to think or to memorize dates.
Well, we do want to.
And if that's the philosophy of education, then the repression of academic freedom is not just something that is of concern to tenured professors. It is something that is basic to the university's educational mission, and it has to apply equally to adjuncts and students.
Yeah, agreed, and I think that's so important. And bringing up the Frankfurter is going to lead us into some discussion here, I hope, about the various justices and their impact on this. Let's start with the first Red Scare. Back when the First Amendment was not as powerful a tool in making decisions pro and con about cases, before World War I in particular, free speech didn't prevail in early cases, but you mentioned Oliver Wendell Holmes' clear and present danger test for measuring the validity of government censorship and creating a standard against which to measure repression in later years. How much has that influenced things in the 20th century, do you think?
A lot, actually. I mean, one of the ironies is the first cases where the Supreme Court is asked to look at the First Amendment rights of political dissenters, and these were people who were opposing U.S. entry into World War I, which was certainly a controversial war. And after all, Wilson had been elected on a platform of keeping us out of the European war. First time the Supreme Court is confronted with people who are being criminally prosecuted for seditious speech and sent to jail for long periods, including Eugene Debs, the popular leader of the Socialist Party, who gave a speech supporting those who were opposing the war. The Supreme Court upholds all these convictions, and Holmes writes the first opinion in a case called U.S. versus Schenck, and he makes the famous metaphor of the freedom of speech would not protect a person from falsely shouting fire in a theater and causing a panic. And so the notion is if speech creates a clear and present danger to the public safety, that it can be suppressed. It's not protected by the First Amendment. Well, that's a very fine principle, but in fact the people who were being prosecuted and sent to jail were not falsely yelling fire in a theater. They were not creating any clear and present danger of obstruction to the military effort or the stability of the government. They were handing out leaflets and making speeches opposing a major foreign policy decision of great import. So he articulates the standard and then doesn't follow it. But Holmes is somebody who is open to rethinking his position, and he is persuaded within less than a year that affirming these convictions of these anti-war protesters is a violation of an important principle of our society, and he starts dissenting in cases where people are being convictions are being affirmed for this kind of political protest. And what happens is gradually, and there is a huge Red Scare just after World War I, and people, you mentioned New York City as a center of radical labor and socialist activism. There's a lot of immigrants. There's a strong working class in New York, and the Attorney General at the time, A. Mitchell Palmer, has just hired a young whippersnapper named J. Edgar Hoover to run a new division of the Justice Department that's going to be involved in political surveillance, essentially. And Palmer and Hoover stage these raids of radical meeting places, immigrant centers, labor organizing, mostly in New York, the Palmer raids. And that's the first American Red Scare. It's very intense and very brutal. It doesn't last all that long. It does have some repercussions in New York, which establishes a series of laws and an investigating committee that starts going after teachers that are suspected of socialist or left-wing sympathy.
Would that be Clayton Lusk's committee?
The Lusk Committee, right. But the Supreme Court by the 30s is beginning to actually apply the clear and present danger test with some real force. And there's a series of decisions which I sort of summarize in the early part of the book, in which the court is recognizing the First Amendment rights of Jehovah's Witnesses to give out leaflets, labor organizers to not be run out of town on a rail, essentially, socialists. So people who need the court recognizes that these minority groups, people who are engaged in non-mainstream, non-conventional activity, are the ones who need the protection of the Constitution.
It's interesting, political realignments. I mean, Jehovah's Witness was singled out because they didn't want to do the Pledge of Allegiance, primarily, I think. And one might consider them conservative today. And a lot of these folks who joined the CP, the Communist Party, they were interested in social reform, doing something about racism and poverty, the kinds of things that progressives even today would be part of. But many renounced it when Stalin made a deal with Hitler. And that sort of changed
the Communist Party, as I have a chapter on the 30s, and it is a sad, really a tragic story of the American left as the progressive and socialist forces get overwhelmed by the energy and enthusiasm of the Communist Party. And at the time, people are very excited about the Soviet Revolution. and they think it's the new utopia. And it takes many people far too long. I mean, the Hitler-Stalin Pact is 1939. There were many signs well before that this was not a utopia, and this was a totalitarian society, and Stalin had ruthlessly eliminated those he perceived to be his political enemies, and basically set up a dictatorial state. And the huge tragedy of the American left is that, as you say, people, really some of the best and the brightest and most dedicated people who were concerned about fascism, concerned about the collapse of capitalism during the Depression and the incredible suffering that entailed, people who were concerned about the brutal racism in this country, joined the Communist Party because it was the most effective and dynamic group around. It was really doing stuff. But it was fatally flawed because its leadership was running back and forth to Moscow for orders, essentially. Who became the leader of the Communist Party was decided by the Politburo in Moscow, the Comintern, actually. And there were these switches in party line that were hugely embarrassing. So the party is virulently leading the charge against fascism, both in Europe and at home, until the Hitler-Stalin Pact, and then suddenly we're not against fascism anymore, and we don't want the U.S. to be helping the Allies who are fighting Hitler. And then after Hitler invades the Soviet Union and the pact is quickly over, once again the Communist Party is the most vigorous and flag-waving. The U.S. has to get into this conflict and help our heroic Soviet brothers. So these are, one series of embarrassments, more than embarrassments, really bad faith and inappropriate in an American party that is part of a democratic process of advocating for change. And that's a sad history, and it makes the Communist Party quite vulnerable in the 50s when, as a result of a lot of different political motivations and a situation in which the Soviet Union is an expansionist threat in Europe, both Democrats and Republicans in this country, for a variety of reasons, ranging from wanting to stop the civil rights movement to roll back the New Deal, exaggerate the threats of stoke up these fears that the Communist Party USA is in some kind of position to actually foment a revolution here, and using that panic, engage in this really sweeping, long period of loyalty investigations and purges. And my book focuses on teachers and professors, but it went on throughout really every field of endeavor in the United States, every profession, every trade, and it went on for a long period of time.
Shifting allegiances was what blew me away about your treatment of the 30s, 40s, and 50s. The Teachers Union and the Communist Party were very active in Brooklyn, Hunter, Queens, and CCNY colleges in New York, and there were some intellectuals in those colleges, and particularly a strong Jewish influence from some of the immigrants that were coming over. But anti-Semitism was rampant at the same time, and that may have been part of what fueled some of the scare, I guess, or the purgings. In New York City was both the headquarters of the Communist Party and a part of the country that had a large Jewish population, and Jews who came whose parents came as immigrants from Eastern Europe and Russia, came with a tradition of socialist and labor consciousness. So this was very, very strong in New York City. And for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. And both the state capitol in Albany and the upstate legislatures and elements in the ethnic mix of New York City are reacting to this with anti-communist, anti-socialist, anti-Semitic rhetoric. It all gets mixed together. And the Teachers Union in New York City, which you mentioned, is a radical crusading union which is fighting on a lot of fronts in addition to bread and butter issues for teachers. It's fighting for improvement in the really deplorable conditions in
the poor and minority neighborhood schools. It's fighting for an end to racism in textbooks. I give some examples in the book, really appalling kind of statements in the textbooks that are being used. Slavery was a happy life, and the slaves had no worries except to do their work well.
Right.
The Board of Education is very resistant to this. And there's a very active fascist movement in the late 30s in New York City at the same time that the teachers union, which is has a lot of communist leadership. Not everybody who's a member of the teachers union is a communist, but certainly there were very active leaders who were communists. The teachers union is under a lot of attack and is raising these issues of fascist and anti-Semitic rallies that are going on, Christian Front rallies in New York. Mm-hmm. So all this plays into a very volatile situation, and the teachers who are targeted for these inquisitions by the City Board of Education are overwhelmingly Jewish. Mm-hmm. And in fact, the New York City Board of Education was the most aggressive in the country, and lots of boards of education were, whether in response to state laws, as in New York, we had a law called the Feinberg Law that required loyalty investigations of all public employees, including teachers and eventually professors at the state colleges. But even before that law requires the investigations, the New York City Board of Education is hauling people in, questioning them about their union activities, asking them if they were ever a member of the Communist Party, and if they said they once were, for 6 months in 1935, name everybody else you saw at a meeting or who signed a petition or was at a Paul Robeson concert, Robeson having been a brilliant African-American singer, actor, and very left-wing in his politics. So what magazines did you read? I mean, the inquisitions were very, very sweeping. And you see, one thing I discovered when I started getting into the files and reading some of these transcripts of these testimonies is really poignant exchanges between the interrogator for the Board of Education, who was Jewish, and the teachers he was interrogating, who were Jewish. And the teachers are accusing him of being no better than the Jewish policemen in the Warsaw Ghetto who collaborated with the Nazis and thereby thought to save themselves. I mean, a kind of over-the-top comparison, but it gives you a sense of the intensity. And after all, these teachers who were under fire, their jobs were on the line, and they were being subjected to an inquisition that they certainly felt violated their freedom of expression, their freedom of association, had nothing to do with their competence as teachers, and some of them were very dedicated teachers.
Let me ask you in the last 3 minutes to take on a great challenge, because there's no way we're going to get through all of what's in this book in our 30-minute interview. First of all, I was surprised myself, because I thought I knew this history pretty well, that you mentioned President Harry Truman got an executive order doing loyalty investigations for federal employees, and that was what started the Red Hunt in the 50s. But I'm interested in discussing it ever so briefly, unfortunately, about the Supreme Court justices that got appointed, particularly under FDR and beyond, who really became advocates for civil liberties and the Bill of Rights in a number of cases going forward. Brennan, William O. Douglas, the judicial restraint of Frankfurter, those guys came together and clashed over these issues and gave us what we have today in terms of what's possible in terms of civil liberties.
Well, that's true. It gave us a lot of what we have today, but it is definitely under threat today.
Sure.
With the current Roberts Court, and I talk about that toward the end of the book.
Mm-hmm.
Douglas was one of FDR's appointees, and he's really, in a way, the hero of the book. And Brennan comes along later. He's an Eisenhower appointee. He has the brilliant political instincts that enable him to assemble 5 justice majorities, sometimes 6, in the period of the Warren Court, when it starts to impose some real limits on the sweeping legislative investigations, loyalty oaths, loyalty programs. But Douglas, with Hugo Black, is throughout the 40s and 50s almost always in dissent. And in the a case that was brought to challenge this Feinberg Law that I mentioned, a typical New York state law, very typical of laws in other states, and modeled on Truman's federal loyalty program, requiring these investigations of all teachers and professors. The Supreme Court upholds the law. Douglas writes a dissent which is not only eloquent but prophetic. He says this kind of law will turn the school system into a spying project. Teachers, parents, students will all be looking over their shoulders. What was the significance of the teacher's reference to socialism or the English teacher's assignment of the grapes of wrath? And he goes on to sketch out what happens when you have this kind of spying system in a school. And he ends by saying, a pall is cast over the classrooms. And this is the very language that is taken up by Brennan 15 years later, reversing that 1952 decision which upholds this loyalty law. The case is called Kayishian versus Board of Regents, and I talk about Harry Kayishian in the book. He starts the book because he's a student at Queens College in New York in the 50s when he sees professors being summarily fired. And later he gets to the State University of New York at Buffalo, and he's in a position to challenge the Feinberg law. And he and a few other professors finally win this victory at the Supreme Court, and Brennan writes an opinion in which he largely borrows from the things Douglas had said 15 years before.
Mm-hmm. I've got maybe 30 seconds for you to say what's going on today. The Red Scare is gone and the terrorist scare is here. And how is this impacting on academic freedom and expression today?
Well, two things to be said. One is we did learn something from the McCarthy era, and we, after the terrorist attacks, we did not have another McCarthy era. There were certainly efforts to blacklist and stigmatize professors who were speaking out and trying to ask some questions about what had become a very hyper-patriotic atmosphere where dissent was really discouraged. So there were some lessons learned, but on the other hand, you're right that terrorism is in some ways the new communism. It's the scare word under whose rubric a lot of sins are hidden. So you can accuse people of being terrorists. You can put people on terrorist lists, groups on terrorist lists. And in one example I give, who gets on the State Department's terrorist list depends on the foreign policy and economic interests of the United States. A liberation group like the African National Congress was on the U.S. terrorist list for many decades.
I wish we could talk more about this. I would encourage our readers to pick this up. It's a good read. It's interesting. History, politics, and law. The book is Priests of Our Democracy, The Supreme Court, Academic Freedom, and the Anti-Communist Purge. We've been talking with the author, Marjorie Hines. I'm your host, Dr. John Cook. Thanks for listening. I remind our listeners that if you don't hear our program, and it's 4 broadcasts a week on our NPR-affiliated FM, you can also go to Good Books Radio Facebook page, and you can catch some of those broadcasts there.